She's a country girl in a city world. This morning, things are really overgrown while I was away. We're going to go and visit the pet cemetery, which is guarded by the remains of Rambo. That's Rambo there. And in there is the graves of two of my most favoured pets, Millie and Annie. Millie on the right, Annie on the left. And I'll tell you a bit about each of them. I began looking to adopt an older dog and looked on a website that had your usual cute little white dogs, Shih Tzus and little terriers. And I applied for a few of them but had no luck. But then I was sent a photo of Millie and they described her as a darling little poppet. And when I looked at her, I had to agree. She was a darling little poppet. And so it was organised for me to go and meet her, and she lived up on the border of Wodonga, Albury. And so Brian and I drove up, and she was staying with a foster carer. Brian stayed in the car when I went into the house to meet Millie, and there was about a half a dozen dogs that greeted me as I knocked on the door, and the lady let me in, and some of those other dogs were care dogs and others were the foster carers' dogs. I hadn't taken many steps into the lounge when I felt a scratching on my leg, and I looked down and Millie was on her back legs scratching at me to pick her up. And from then on she was very rarely out of my arms when I could hold her. I fell in love with her instantly, and the owner or the foster lady told me that others had come to look at Millie. A couple from South Yarra had actually said that they would adopt her, and then had gone home but never rang back again. She told me that Millie had been found wandering the streets, and I could never for the life of me understand how anyone could have let Millie go and what Millie was wandering looking for. Indeed, when we got her home in the first few days, she did tend to go wandering, and one time in the first day or two I noticed she wasn't next to me as I was hanging the washing out, and I ran looking for her, and I found her on the road outside our house with a truck barrelling down at a distance, and I scooped her up and saved her. And early days when we went camping, I remember one time her wandering off from the campsite, and we had to chase and find her until eventually she decided that it was me she wanted to be with all the time. And Millie was a quiet dog. She didn't bark at people at the door. She didn't bark at noises or anything. The only time she ever barked was when she was in the car and left alone without me. If she couldn't be with me, she would bark. And so began our friendship, and very rarely were we separate. And when I didn't have her with me, I had anxiety, and I missed her terribly. Times I was in hospital, I missed her. Times the first time she went and had her hair done and they kept her for a few hours, I missed her terribly. Some people called her Toto from The Wizard of Oz, but actually one time I was sitting in a car with her and someone tapped on the window and they informed me that not only was Millie an Australian Terrier, but she was a Sydney Terrier. And the people knocking on my window to tell me this knew that fact because they had owned Sydney Terriers. I don't know about that. Millie was with me when I went through some hardships and some hard times, and we had to go and live together back in Noble Park. And I remember moving into our room at Noble Park and the terrible flea infestation, and Millie scratching and biting all night, and the next day going and buying chemicals from Bunnings and fumigating the room so that Millie and I could stay there. And she came to probably 100 or more AA meetings with me, and she was there when I really needed her and when I really needed her love. She was generous in giving me that. As she grew older, her breathing started to get worse. I'd noticed she'd always been a wheezy dog. I think she was about 10 years old when I adopted her. And then towards the end, she started to have fits where the poor little thing, I would find her and she'd be stiff as a board. She'd be laying on her side and I'd pick her up and put her in her bed. She could no longer jump on the bed as she used to be able to, so she had a cushion next to the bed with me. And when we went to AA meetings, she had her own cushion that I'd take, that she'd sit on. And eventually the time came when the coughing became too bad, and the vet told me that it was time for her to leave us. And so I put on a brave face, and even on that last day I went to dig where she would have her forever home. I went to dig her grave, and she came out. She struggled to walk by this stage, but I looked over my shoulder and she was standing watching me, wanting to be with me as I prepared her final resting place. And so we went into the vet. I held her in my arms, I kissed her, I told her how much I loved her, and we put her to sleep. And I did the brave thing, which I really didn't want to do, but I was her mum and I needed to look after her right to her last breath. And I did that to the best of my abilities, and I still miss my little Millie. In around 2006, we left Sydney, a group of friends and myself, and we found a rental in a place called Noble Park, in a very basic, no frills little rental house, just red brick, no heating, no air conditioning. And we ran that as a share house with people coming and going for the next 10 years or so. Not long after arriving, I noticed that there were cats hanging around the back. There was an area under the house where I think feral cats were living. And the first one that I laid eyes upon was a cat that I called the Little One. And he was a blackened sort of grey cat. And I got a cat trap and I caught the Little One and I brought him inside. And so began my tenure as the mad cat lady of Noble Park. So not long after the Little One arrived and I was starting to tame him in my bedroom, another little grey tortoiseshell cat arrived with her sister. I caught those two as well, and I put them in the room with the cage, and I went out to have a look if there were any more around, and I heard a crash and bang, and when I got back to the room, these two little grey cats had run around the walls and knocked everything off the TV, the CD collection, everything off the bookshelves, and they'd squeezed their way out of the window and they were gone. But not long afterwards, that one of those little grey cats came back. I called her Dottie, and she came back with 4 kittens, and I started trying to approach the kittens. They were incredibly fast and difficult to catch. But one day, one of those little kittens came into the back door. We kept the back kitchen door open all times for these cats to come and go as I began to feed them. And on this occasion, one of these little kittens stepped too far into the kitchen to see what I was doing, so that I could step between her and her escape, which is what I did. And realizing she couldn't now get past me to escape, she ran into the house as I had planned, and she ran down the hallway, and I scooped her up, and I opened my bedroom door, which I always kept closed because the little one was in there until he was domesticated, and I called out to him, "Little one, this is yours. You're going to bring her up with me." And that was little Annie. And Annie became a very much loved little member of our cat family. Sometimes I'd have 4 of them sleeping on the bed at night with me, these adopted ferals. I found homes for some of the others, but I kept 4 of them. And at 5 kilo a cat, towards the end of our time at Noble Park, there was 20 kilo of cats sleeping on the bed with me. When I moved up to the farm, moved in with Brian, Annie was the first one to come and to adapt to living on the farm. And she was here for about a week before I brought the other 2 up. We'd lost Eddie along the way, but the little one and Dottie, Annie's mum, soon came up in their cat carrier. And so began the second phase of Annie's life as a farm cat. And she absolutely loved it here, sleeping on top of the water tower, catching rabbits, lots of mice and rats, the occasional bird, always very affectionate with me. She absolutely adored me, and I loved her to bits too. The other cats, we lost those at some stage, and so Annie became the last of the Mohicans, and the last of the feral Noble Park cats. And in May of this year, she was in a bad way. She'd lost a lot of her teeth, and she seemed to have developed a cancer on her nose, which was always bleeding, and her hip started to bulge out. She had trouble walking. I think that she had bone cancer. She'd taken to Brian. She absolutely loved Brian, cuddling up against his tummy while he watched TV on his cushion at night. She loved the fire, and she loved her life here at the farm with me. So when it was time for Annie to leave us once again, I took her to the vet and I held her in my arms. She had a very strong little heart. She was a tough little thing, and as the vet gave her the potion to put her to sleep, she groaned, and I kissed her, and she died in my arms. So she's buried alongside Millie, and she used to give Millie the odd swat when Millie would walk past. I don't think she does that anymore. But in her grave is some biscuits and a note to the God or higher power of her understanding to look after her. That she's been a terrific, faithful little friend to me, and I always miss my dear Annie.